been to housemate auditions where they're asked you, like, whether you like Coldplay. I'm not sure what that says about a person. I was asked, like, whether I took acid, and that was a real prerequisite to stay at the house. When tenants are not taken seriously, when housing is neglected, when people are not listened to and whole communities are not listened to, what happens?
What is the housing crisis, and where did that sort of start?
More than 17.5 million people across the UK don't have a stable, safe and secure place to live. And this is everything from, hugely expensive private rents to homes in disrepair from kind of mould or structural issues or damp or whatever, to a real dearth and underproduction of social housing at social rented cost. And marginalised communities really feel the brunt of that, who sort of typically maybe 50 years ago would be in social housing, now are in private rent accommodation, which is just not feasible. The crisis is really about, how precarious we all feel in very different ways, how we are going to manage the future together, and what things look like next, for people who are really struggling day to day.
And with the deficit in social housing, why is that become sort of so neglected, both as kind of like buildings themselves that are, in disrepair or being demolished, and then also not provision of new?
I think it's just that housing doesn't seem to be a priority in the way that I think about it, which is that it is the thing that grounds us, that everything else orbits around. I don't think that it's seen like that in political terms. In the book, I really, one of the first places I write about is the Green Man Lane estate. And I write about, what that felt like to live in, my neighbours, but also how the architecture led us to lots of cultural production. So, the thinness of the walls and how that enabled different sounds and different music to like escape through the walls, and how that finessed our ear. And as we know, that's one of the reasons why council estates are such like beautiful kind of hubs of music and, lots of kind of culture and shebeens and house parties. And, there's such a rich history of cultural production from music to art and whatever else. And so I think it's just about, an inability to see that. And, I use a motif of Pebble Dash, which I actually love.
Yeah.
I don't know if you like Pebble Dash.
I quite like it. I liked your description of it with like the glittering, like you make it like anyone who doesn't like Pebble Dash, read this and you'll love the Pebble Dash.
Yeah, like your geodes and... But, I think it's just about always reframing our gaze, because this has real world impact. Once you suddenly start seeing these things as beautiful, or you understand the beauty that can be embedded within this, even though Pebble Dash is actually used to conceal negligence, like shoddy brickwork, you can start to understand, even if you disagree with the way that tenants are treated, and I write about Grenfell being, possibly our most high-profile example of this, which was like when tenants are not taken seriously, when housing is neglected, when people are not listened to and whole communities are not listened to, what happens? What's our worst possible case scenario? And this is happening across the country. So I think it's just a fundamental disconnect between how so many people in this country are living and just how beautiful it can be when you're part of it and you're of it, and you see it and you feel it all the time.
And you went back to Green Man Lane estate when it was kind of due to be demolished, and you went back and you found your old bedroom, kind of the whole place in disrepair. What was that like to see it in that state?
Well, I think it's just a lesson in loss, and it's also a lesson in like the extent to which we have to mourn these places that are no longer fit for purpose. And there's something about social housing in particular where sometimes it feels like it was never really yours anyway. So you don't really have the agency to like mourn over it because it belongs to the state, and that's something else. And I try and resist that. But in the writing of my book, I went to quite a few of the places that I'd lived. And, when I started writing the book, just to kind of make sure I was kind of getting some of those feelings and getting some of the descriptions right. And then towards the end, I was like, actually, I actually want to remember it in a certain way. And the actual house that I was looking at overtook the story a little bit. So so I just drew a little bit on like memory and kind of made larger points. I didn't visit every place because, when I visited my old estate, it was really sad. It was like my bedroom was boarded up and it was like in such extreme disrepair. And I didn't want to remember it like that, And there's a psychological term in the book called that I refer to called solastalgia, which is like a deep nostalgia for a place that you've lived, like for a building, from a home, from a room. And, we're constantly having to manage that. As people move around and are increasingly precarious, we constantly have to manage those little moments of mourning, how you deal with those little losses, how you think about a place that you lived and what was real and what was nostalgia and what you really lose when you have to move all the time.
Yeah. And in the book you talk about the many problems with private rentals. I wondered what your worst housemate interview you'd been to was.
Okay, so this is when I was in my mid-20s and I was doing a lot of spare room housemate auditions, and I just had a breakup and had nowhere to live, and I was like staying on a friend's sofa, and it was pretty hard going. So I was kind of like going around various houses for these auditions, and I was like, one time I went to a housing co-op, which I didn't realise was a co-op because it wasn't advertised as such, and I was asked like whether I took acid, and that was a real prerequisite to stay at the house, and whether I was prepared to cook for the sort of 8 or 9 other tenants that lived there, which I didn't realise who also lived there because the listing said only 3 lived there. And just I've been to housemate auditions where they asked you like whether you like Coldplay. I'm not sure what that says about a person, but like, do you like Coldplay? Because it's very important. So, there was a lot of this kind of thing. I talk about how the internet and the idea of like the optimized self online becomes like really, really sinister when we start thinking about it in terms of housing, because suddenly you construct this idea of like the optimized housemate and what that means. And you have to kind of present yourself a certain way online. And, this is often how people choose housemates. They're Googling you or they're looking at your social media and, they're asking questions of you like, are you this person? Are you going to give me some cultural capital by proximity? What does that mean? And so the kind of like, sort of like digital culture becomes so embedded in like these things and, suddenly becomes like, I don't know, the metric in which we can be measured against to work out whether we have a home to call our own or not.
Yeah. And what does the government kind of, in terms of legislation, what do they say are the worst conditions that it's okay for a private tenant to live with? Like, is there any bar that they have set in terms of what's all right?
The Homes Fit for Human Habitation Act is kind of what is loosely used for us to work out what is inhabitable and what is disrepair. So really, when you think of it like that, it's like, okay, so this is like loosely the bar, like, is your home fit for human habitation?
Right.
But we know that this becomes like very loose and very arbitrary when it comes to policy and when it comes to advocating for, these things, because we're constantly told that actually that doesn't fall under that. So, a few years ago, for instance, for disrepair claims like mould or damp, you'd be able to access legal aid. You'd be able to, most people would be able to go and see their claim. That's not the case now. Lots of tenants have to go through like no win, no fee type, kind of legal administrative loopholes, or they have to pay and it's extremely expensive. So it would be helpful for government to give us very clear guidelines of what they mean when they talk about disrepair and what we can do about it. And I think one of the ways that we can do that is by not only having landlord registers, but also having things like housing MOTs, which like community organisations like Acorn advocate for, which is saying here is a certain standard that us as tenants and, tenants' residents unions recognise as a fit standard. We make our own standards and we make sure that the housing is measured against that. So I think that, I'm really inspired by those kind of policies that come from community organisations, and I really hope that we see more of that.
And in writing the book, what would you say is maybe the most memorable kind of conversation or interview you did with someone?
A lot of my most memorable things were the kind of throwaway comments that were given that I went back to research more. So one of the things that I did towards the end of the pandemic, when young people were going back to school, was a couple of primary school workshops and chatting to people about documenting their pandemics. And it was like year 3 and 4s and then year 5s and 6s. And as I was preparing for them, I was doing Zooms with various primary school teachers. And I had a conversation with one primary school teacher, and she was saying that one of her year 2s had spent the majority of lockdown in a basement flat, which had no stairs. And when he came back to school, he'd forgotten how to use the stairs.
Wow.
And so I was just, and it was just a throwaway comment, but I was just so struck by how our bodies are molded to the places that we live.
Yeah.
And actually that kind of choreography and psychology are so interlinked with how and where we live. And so kind of made a note of that, and then did lots of deep research about why that happens, and, you know, if there are other examples, and, you know, explored those sorts of things. And so that was really interesting. And then when I was reporting on Grenfell, in my double life as a journalist, one of the throwaway things from one of the meetings was that somebody was talking about shipping containers. And so when I was re-listening to the transcript, I was like, oh, is that, I don't know whether that was like hyperbole or like how true that really is. And that's what led me to really finding people who had been housed in shipping containers. So it's all those throwaway things, you know. When I was like writing about taste, a couple of people made some throwaway comments about like, oh, you know, working class taste is just like, you know, it's tacky, or it's like, it's not revered. And then I got into a like whole deep dive about, you know, taste policing and who makes those aesthetic decisions about what is and what isn't beautiful and what doesn't appear in a lifestyle magazine. So yeah, I love that. I just love the opportunity. And that's the thing with writing a book, where somebody says something interesting and you can make a note of it, and then you can spend like a couple of weeks just exploring that thought. And I really love that.
Well, it's so brilliant to chat to you. And thank you so much for writing such an interesting book.
Thank you.